We've all seen the videos, but have you ever wondered how the system let it get this far? Long before their tragic public exposure began, long before millions of strangers watched clips of a family hidden in the hills of West Virginia, there were decades where warning signs existed in plain sight. This is not just the story of the Whittakers. It is the story of structural failure, institutional exhaustion, rural neglect, and the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask. How did a profoundly vulnerable family live for generations without meaningful intervention? Tonight, we break down 7 reasons local social services appeared to ignore the Whittakers for years, and why the answer may be far more complicated than simple cruelty or indifference. The first thing people misunderstand about the Whittaker story is geography. West Virginia is not simply a place on a map. It represents a type of America that many institutions struggle to reach consistently. Rural poverty creates invisibility in ways urban poverty does not. In a city, dysfunction is crowded together. Systems encounter it constantly. Shelters, hospitals, transit stations, schools, social workers, emergency responders. Visibility itself forces interaction. But deep rural poverty works differently. It hides behind distance, isolation, and generational withdrawal from institutions. That matters because the Whittakers were not living in the center of public systems. They existed at the edge of them. And at the edge of systems, people can disappear quietly for decades. Reason 1. Rural isolation made regular oversight nearly impossible. The roads leading into places like are not symbolic roads. They are literal barriers. Long winding routes through mountains, forests, and scattered homes where neighbors may live miles apart. For underfunded county agencies already overwhelmed with cases, reaching isolated households regularly becomes difficult before the investigation even begins. Social workers in rural counties often carry enormous caseloads spread across huge geographic areas. One worker may cover multiple towns, emergency cases, elderly care visits, child welfare concerns, disability assessments, and crisis intervention simultaneously. Transportation itself becomes part of the workload. People online often imagine social services as a constantly present force monitoring vulnerable populations carefully. The reality in many rural regions is much harsher. Agencies are understaffed, underfunded, overworked, and reactive instead of proactive. They respond to immediate crises because they lack resources for long-term monitoring. That creates a dangerous gap. Families like the Whittakers can remain technically known to local systems without receiving meaningful sustained intervention. A household may exist on paper, may occasionally receive benefits, disability checks, food assistance, or sporadic visits, but still function largely outside structured oversight. And the more isolated the family becomes culturally, emotionally, and geographically, the easier it becomes for institutions to normalize minimal involvement. That normalization is critical to understanding what happened here, because the second reason may be even more disturbing. Reason 2. Generational dysfunction became normalized by the surrounding community. People forget something important about isolated rural communities. Residents often know vulnerable families long before outsiders ever hear their names. The Whittakers were not discovered by locals. They were already part of local reality. Children grow up hearing stories. Adults become accustomed to seeing Satan conditions repeatedly. And over time, shock disappears. This is one of the darkest aspects of long-term poverty. Conditions outsiders immediately recognize as alarming can slowly become emotionally normalized to the people living around them. Not because neighbors are evil, but because exposure changes perception. If a family has lived the same way for decades, community members stop seeing the situation as an emergency. It becomes just how they are. That phrase destroys accountability more effectively than open cruelty ever could. Just how they are. Not dangerous. Not urgent. Not changing. Just familiar. And familiarity reduces intervention, especially when the household itself avoids conflict with outsiders. The Whittakers were not known publicly as violent criminals terrorizing the community. They were viewed more as isolated, unusual, poor, and vulnerable. That distinction matters because social systems often prioritize households considered actively dangerous before households considered chronically dysfunctional, which leads directly to the third reason. Reason 3. Disability complicated legal intervention. One of the hardest realities in adult protective services is this: being disabled does not automatically remove someone's legal rights. That creates enormous complexity in cases like the Whittakers. People online often ask simple questions. Why didn't authorities just remove them earlier? Why didn't someone force the family into care? But adult protective systems operate under strict legal boundaries. Adults, even vulnerable adults, retain rights unless authorities can prove severe incapacity, abuse, or imminent danger sufficient to override personal autonomy. That threshold is much higher than most viewers realize, especially in rural Appalachian communities where distrust of government intervention already runs deep. Authorities cannot simply remove adults because a house looks poor or unusual. They require documentation, assessments, court processes, evaluations, and evidence strong enough to survive legal scrutiny. And cases involving cognitively impaired adults become even more difficult when caregiving is informal and family-based. Because who exactly is failing whom? Betty and Larry were not strangers exploiting the household from outside. They were aging relatives who had spent decades caring for profoundly vulnerable family members with almost no institutional support themselves. That creates legal ambiguity. Was the household inadequate? Very likely. Was it intentionally abusive? Far harder to prove consistently over long periods. And when systems cannot prove clear criminal neglect, intervention often becomes partial instead of transformative. Benefits: occasional check-ins, temporary involvement, but not full removal, not institutional placement, not permanent restructuring, until finally something changes dramatically enough to force action. That dramatic shift often arrives through public exposure. And that brings us to the fourth reason. Reason 4. The internet forced scrutiny local systems had avoided for years. Before viral attention, the Whittakers existed mostly inside local awareness. After viral attention, they existed inside national scrutiny. That changes institutional behavior immediately, because once millions of viewers begin discussing vulnerable adults publicly, agencies suddenly face pressure they never faced before. Questions intensify. Complaints increase. Documentation spreads online. Journalists appear. Creators investigate. Public embarrassment becomes possible. And public embarrassment accelerates institutional response faster than quiet suffering ever does. This pattern repeats constantly in America. A situation remains unresolved for years until visibility makes inaction impossible. Then suddenly systems move quickly. Not necessarily because conditions changed overnight, but because exposure changed the consequences of doing nothing. The tragic irony is that the same internet attention many people blame for destabilizing the family may also have been the force that finally triggered meaningful intervention at all. Without visibility, the household may have remained structurally unchanged indefinitely. That is the uncomfortable contradiction sitting at the center of this story. Exposure created chaos, but exposure also created accountability. And once accountability arrived, years of accumulated instability could no longer remain hidden behind rural isolation and community normalization. But even that is not the deepest reason authorities struggled to act. Because the fifth reason involves something much larger than one family. It involves America itself. Specifically, how America treats poverty when poverty becomes generational. In many parts of rural Appalachia, severe poverty has existed so long that entire institutional responses evolved around management instead of transformation. Systems distribute assistance, disability checks, food aid, basic survival support. But long-term structural rehabilitation rarely arrives. Not because social workers do not care, but because the scale of rural poverty exceeds the scale of available resources. And families like the Whittakers become trapped inside that gap, too vulnerable to function independently, too legally autonomous for easy removal, too isolated for consistent oversight, too normalized locally to trigger emergency response, and too poor to build stability without outside intervention. That is where the story becomes heartbreaking. Because by the time outsiders finally saw the Whittakers online, the underlying conditions shaping their lives were already generations old. The cameras did not create the dysfunction. They revealed how long the dysfunction had existed without meaningful systemic correction. And once the world saw it, the question was no longer whether the situation was tragic. The question became why tragedy had been allowed to harden into permanence for so many years in the first place. Reason 5. The system was built to respond to crisis, not chronic suffering. This may be the most important reality in the entire story because it explains why families like the Whittakers can remain visible and invisible at the same time. Most people imagine social services as a protective structure constantly monitoring vulnerable individuals and stepping in whenever conditions become unsafe. But in reality, many agencies function more like emergency management systems than long-term rehabilitation systems. They respond when something dramatic happens: a hospitalization, a violent incident, a credible abuse report, a death, a missing person, a court order, an immediate threat. But chronic suffering is different. Chronic suffering settles into the background. It becomes paperwork instead of emergency response. And over time, agencies overwhelmed with acute crisis cases begin prioritizing households where danger appears immediate and undeniable. That creates a brutal hierarchy of intervention. A vulnerable family surviving in poor conditions for decades may actually receive less urgent attention than a suddenly violent household experiencing one catastrophic event. Not because authorities believe the vulnerable family is safe, but because the system itself is triaging human suffering constantly. This is especially true in rural counties where staffing shortages can become extreme. Some social workers handle impossible workloads. Cases involving addiction, elderly neglect, child abuse, disability care, domestic violence, homelessness, and mental illness all competing simultaneously for limited attention. Inside that environment, long-term dysfunction becomes administratively survivable. A family can remain in difficult conditions for years as long as no single event forces escalation beyond what the system can legally ignore. And for decades, the Whittakers appear to have existed inside exactly that administrative gray zone. Known, but not transformed. Assisted occasionally, but not structurally stabilized. Watched loosely, but not deeply protected. That distinction matters because many viewers assume the lack of dramatic intervention means nobody knew the family existed. The far more uncomfortable possibility is that the family was partially known all along, but never reached the threshold required for large-scale institutional action, until public exposure changed the equation. Reason 6. Appalachian distrust of outsiders created resistance to intervention. One of the biggest mistakes outsiders make when discussing the Whittakers is assuming the family existed independently from Appalachian culture itself. They did not. Rural Appalachian communities carry long histories of distrust toward institutions, outsiders, journalists, and government systems. Some of that distrust comes from generations of exploitation, poverty, political neglect, and media stereotyping. Families living in isolated areas often develop protective social structures specifically designed to limit outside interference. Privacy becomes survival. Silence becomes defense. And that cultural reality complicates every form of intervention. Because meaningful social work depends heavily on cooperation. Workers need communication, access, trust, consistent follow-up. And when families fear judgment or removal, they often minimize problems, avoid outsiders, or selectively reveal information. This dynamic appears repeatedly throughout the Whittaker story. Visitors described hesitation, suspicion, resistance. Locals warning outsiders to stay away. Protective behavior surrounding the property. Even Mark himself reportedly encountered hostility and distrust during early visits before relationships gradually formed. That reaction did not emerge from nowhere. It reflects a community already conditioned to protect itself from external scrutiny. And unfortunately, vulnerable individuals living inside those environments become harder to assess accurately because every interaction is filtered through fear of institutional consequences. Especially when disability is involved. Families often worry that outside attention will lead directly to separation, removal, institutionalization, loss of autonomy. And whether those fears are justified or not, they shape behavior powerfully. That may explain why some of the most chaotic later developments unfolded the way they did. Because once the family became publicly visible, they were suddenly navigating systems and pressures they had spent generations trying to avoid. The internet accelerated that collision violently, and that collision exposed another uncomfortable reality. Sometimes vulnerable families distrust systems because they already know those systems cannot fully save them anyway. That is the seventh and perhaps darkest reason of all. Reason 7. America has no clear long-term answer for families like the Whittakers. This is where the story stops being about one Appalachian household and becomes something much larger. Because once people ask why authorities did not intervene sooner, another question follows naturally. Intervene into what? Where exactly were the Whittakers supposed to go? What permanent structure existed capable of caring for multiple elderly, cognitively vulnerable adults with complex needs, severe poverty, emotional dependency on each other, and limited ability to adapt to institutional life? People often imagine intervention as a clean rescue, but the reality is rarely clean. Long-term state case systems are themselves overwhelmed. Group homes face staffing shortages. Rural healthcare systems struggle constantly. Mental health services remain underfunded. Disability care infrastructure in many parts of America is already stretched to breaking point, which means authorities frequently operate under a grim practical reality. Unless conditions become catastrophically unsafe, keeping vulnerable adults with family may still appear preferable to destabilizing them through institutional separation. That calculation may horrify outsiders emotionally, but it exists throughout social services constantly. Not because systems are heartless, but because systems are forced to choose between imperfect outcomes every day. The Whittakers embodied that dilemma perfectly. Keeping the family together preserved familiarity, emotional bonds, and community continuity. But it also preserved instability, unsafe living conditions, dependency, and lack of professional care. Removing them promised structure, medical oversight, and safety. But it also meant separation, trauma, institutionalization, and loss of the only environment many of them had ever known. There was never going to be a painless solution. That is what makes the story so tragic. By the time authorities reportedly intervened in 2025, they were not solving a problem. They were managing accumulated damage decades in the making. Damage created by poverty, isolation, institutional underfunding, disability without support, addiction surrounding the family, public exposure, and the collapse of informal caregiving systems that had somehow held together far longer than anyone expected. This is why simplistic internet reactions fail so badly when discussing the Whittakers. Some viewers want clear villains. Social services failed them. Mark exploited them. Betty lied. Larry enabled chaos. BJ destroyed the family. But reality is structurally uglier than that. The Whittakers existed at the intersection of multiple failing systems simultaneously. Healthcare systems that rarely reached isolated rural disability cases effectively. Social service systems forced into reactive crisis management instead of proactive long-term care. Economic systems that abandoned large parts of Appalachia generations ago. Internet systems that monetized vulnerability faster than they protected. And family systems stretched beyond what informal caregiving could realistically sustain. Every layer contributed pressure. Every layer failed partially. And by the time millions of viewers discovered the family online, the story was already near its breaking point. That is why the internet's reaction became so emotionally chaotic afterward. Because viewers were not simply watching one family. They were witnessing what happens when generational neglect finally becomes visible. The public saw the house, the clutter, the unusual behavior, the poverty, but underneath those visible details sat decades of institutional exhaustion and social abandonment most viewers never fully considered. And perhaps the most painful truth is this. The system surrounding the Whittakers probably did not ignore them because nobody cared. They ignored them because American systems often normalize long-term suffering when suffering becomes familiar enough, especially in places already forgotten politically and economically. That normalization destroys urgency, until suddenly the suffering goes viral. Then everyone asks why nobody acted sooner. But by then, the damage is already generational, and no intervention, no matter how aggressive, can fully undo what decades of accumulated instability have already shaped inside a family. That is the real horror hidden underneath the Whittaker story. Not simply that vulnerable people lived in hardship, but that hardship lasted so long it stopped looking abnormal to the system surrounding them. And once suffering becomes ordinary inside institutions, rescue rarely arrives before collapse does first. The hardest part of the Whittaker story is not deciding who failed them. The hardest part is realizing how many people probably believed they were helping while the situation quietly continued deteriorating year after year. Because structural failure rarely looks dramatic while it is happening. It looks ordinary. A welfare check that leads nowhere. A brief visit. A conversation on a porch. A report filed and closed. A family that appears poor but stable enough. A vulnerable adult still surrounded by relatives. A home that looks rough but technically occupied. A caregiver insisting they can manage. A community accustomed to seeing hardship. And slowly, over decades, the abnormal becomes administratively routine. That may explain why the Whittakers existed in public whispers long before they existed in viral media. Locals knew about them. Neighbors knew. Community members knew. Stories circulated. But knowledge is not the same thing as intervention. And intervention is not the same thing as transformation. Even after the family became famous online, the deeper structural problems remained almost impossible to solve quickly. People donated money. Visitors arrived. Content creators documented conditions. Temporary repairs happened. Groceries appeared. Outings happened. Vehicles were discussed. Fundraisers exploded. But none of that automatically creates a sustainable long-term care system for elderly disabled adults living in generational poverty. That requires something far larger than internet sympathy. It requires infrastructure, professional oversight, guardianship structures, medical continuity, mental health support, disability specialists, housing stabilization, case management, and most importantly, consistency over many years. The internet excels at attention. It performs much worse at continuity. That difference matters because attention can temporarily disguise structural collapse. For a while, the Whittakers appeared surrounded by help. People visited constantly. Videos generated revenue. Supporters sent donations. But underneath the visibility, the core instability remained unresolved. The house still struggled. The caregiving structure still depended heavily on aging relatives. Outside influences still created chaos. The vulnerable adults still lacked comprehensive independent advocacy. And eventually the public narrative itself became unstable. One creator blamed another. Accusations spread. Fraud allegations surfaced. Questions about money intensified. People argued over who genuinely cared and who was profiting. At that point, the original humanitarian concern became tangled inside online conflict and monetization. And that may be the moment the situation became impossible to control privately anymore. Because once vulnerable adults become central figures inside internet drama, institutional scrutiny often increases rapidly. Not necessarily because authorities suddenly discover new conditions, but because visibility creates pressure. Pressure creates liability, and liability forces systems to act more decisively than they previously did in silence. That is one of the darkest ironies in the entire story. For years, the family may have received too little intervention. Then suddenly they received overwhelming intervention all at once. The pendulum swung from neglect to scrutiny almost overnight. And the people least capable of understanding that transformation were the vulnerable adults at the center of it. Timmy, Lorraine, Ray, individuals who reportedly relied heavily on routine, familiarity, recognizable faces, and environmental predictability suddenly became subjects of national attention and eventually state involvement. That kind of disruption carries emotional consequences outsiders rarely consider carefully enough. Because even unsafe environments can still feel emotionally secure to the people who have lived inside them their entire lives. Human beings adapt to familiarity powerfully, especially cognitively vulnerable individuals. So when viewers online say things like they should have been removed years ago, the statement may be factually understandable from a safety perspective. But emotionally, the reality becomes far more complicated. Removal is not emotionally neutral. Institutional transition is not emotionally neutral. Separation from lifelong caregivers is not emotionally neutral. Even when intervention is necessary, grief still exists afterward. That is why the Whittaker story feels so morally heavy. There is no clean emotional resolution available. If authorities intervene late, people ask why systems ignored suffering. If authorities intervene aggressively, people mourn the separation and trauma created by removal. Either way, damage already exists. And perhaps that is the clearest proof of systemic failure of all. A truly functioning support system would not wait until only painful options remain. It would intervene earlier, more gently, more consistently, before collapse forces emergency decisions, before internet spectacle replaces privacy, before elderly caregivers become overwhelmed, before vulnerable adults become public symbols instead of protected individuals, before outsiders begin treating suffering like content. But America's social systems often struggle to operate that way, especially in isolated rural poverty. Resources arrive late. Attention arrives late. Medical care arrives late. Mental health support arrives late. And by the time institutions fully mobilize, families are frequently already exhausted beyond recovery. The Whittakers were not the first vulnerable rural family caught inside that cycle. They simply became one of the most publicly visible examples of it. That visibility forced millions of people to confront uncomfortable realities most prefer not to think about. How many families exist quietly in similar conditions right now? How many elderly caregivers are barely holding together vulnerable relatives without meaningful support? How many rural households survive through improvisation instead of proper infrastructure? How many cognitively disabled adults remain dependent on unstable systems because no sustainable alternatives exist nearby? And how many of those situations remain invisible only because cameras never arrived? That may be the final lesson hidden underneath the Whittaker story. The tragedy was never just the family itself. The tragedy was how unsurprising their existence actually is to people who understand rural poverty, disability care shortages, and institutional underfunding in America. Families like this do not emerge from nowhere. They emerge from decades of accumulated abandonment, economic abandonment, medical abandonment, educational abandonment, psychological abandonment, and eventually social abandonment. Then one day the internet discovers them and reacts with shock as if the suffering appeared suddenly. But suffering like this is rarely sudden. It grows quietly, year after year, generation after generation, until eventually the world notices. And by then, almost every possible solution already comes too late to prevent pain. That is why the Whittaker story should not only provoke curiosity, it should provoke reflection. Because the real question is no longer simply why social services ignored one vulnerable family for so long. The real question is how many other families are currently surviving in silence until visibility finally forces systems to care, and whether society is willing to build structures that protect vulnerable people before crisis and spectacle become the only reasons anyone pays attention at all. In the end, the Whittaker story is not really about one family living in the hills of West Virginia. It is about what happens when vulnerability exists longer than public attention spans. For years, people passed responsibility from one place to another. Neighbors assumed someone else would intervene. Officials saw poverty but not always emergency. Communities normalized conditions that outsiders later found shocking. And the family itself survived the only way it knew how, by staying together, staying hidden, and adapting to hardship until hardship became ordinary. Then the internet arrived. Suddenly millions of people saw what local systems had quietly lived beside for decades. But visibility alone cannot repair generational neglect. A viral video cannot replace medical infrastructure. Donations cannot replace professional oversight. Sympathy cannot replace long-term protection. And outrage cannot undo years already lost. That is why the story remains so painful. Because by the time serious intervention finally happened, everyone involved was already carrying damage. The vulnerable adults had spent decades without adequate support. The caregivers were elderly and overwhelmed. The house itself had deteriorated, and the world outside had turned their suffering into public spectacle before meaningful stability ever arrived. So when people ask why social services ignored the Whittakers for so many years, the answer is probably not one single failure. It was many small failures led together over time. Rural isolation, poverty, underfunded systems, caregiver exhaustion, disability complexity, community normalization, institutional delay, and a society that often notices vulnerable people only after their suffering becomes impossible to ignore. The Whittakers became famous because people were shocked by what they saw. But the deeper tragedy may be this. Long before the cameras arrived, the signs were already there. Almost nobody stopped long enough to change the outcome.